So, and every time Professor Wang comes up with a topic on whether on overseas Chinese or something else, everybody is surprised by how refreshingly different it is. And this time when we saw that he was going to talk about expectations and changing expectation and continuing expectation, they said, wow, why didn't we think about this? So let's hear Professor Wang. Over to you.
Thank you very much. After all that, I've got to say a few words about Prasenjit too. And simply this, that we've had the great fortune of having Prasenjit to head RE for all these years, and it has been a tremendous lift for the Institute, and we're very sorry he's leaving. So anyway, you left behind a great legacy, and I think there are lots of people here who will work very hard to keep up the work that you have started here. So I appreciate the chance to say a few words before he leaves at his last conference, as he declared. I also appreciate the fact that Jian Li and Xiaoan has put this on. It's certainly very timely that with all the big changes around pertaining to almost every aspect that you can think of that affects how we look at China and Chinese abroad, and almost everything pertaining to China. I remember the days when you could hardly find an item on China in the Western press, or most press, any newspapers that I sort of picked up in those days, or even magazines. But today, almost every day, there's something, more than something. It's usually lots of big articles that involve China. So it is a major change. So that's the background, I think, to all this age of global modernity is the rise of China. And this has been, of course, talked about almost everywhere, almost overdoing it, as Jian suggests. And it's hard sometimes to get a correct, right perspective on what this really means for all of us. So for the more humble subject of Chinese diaspora studies, this has also become very important. And when I was asked to say something for this conference, one of the thoughts that came to mind was something that I had been observing for a while, but not really very clear how significant it is or whether it's meaningful. But for me, it was interesting. So I thought I'd put this forward and try to approach the subject and see what I can do with it. Expectations, of course, is not a easy concept to handle. It's, in fact, the more I think about it, the more slippery it gets. It's a difficult concept. So I'm not going to try and cover every aspect of it, but to pick on one area which is more obvious and publicly acknowledged, and see what we can do with that, and see how far we can go beyond that. The area that I would look at is the area of very obvious areas of the expectations of the migrants themselves, the expectations of China at different times about Chinese going out and staying out and not coming back, the expectations of the countries receiving, the host country receiving all these thousands and thousands of Chinese over time, and even more so today, surprisingly, to some people. And thirdly, those residents, natives, indigenous peoples of the various places where the Chinese went to. What did they expect? What did they expect to begin with? What they learned to expect over time? And what do they expect now with the rise of China and all that sort of thing? So these are the very obvious ones, but I'll take these first because there are all sorts of other things that the concept of the idea of expectations might arouse. So these are the four areas that I look at. And I looking at just these areas alone, there's always been a mix of expectations, as you can imagine. Just that we never properly recorded or seen any records of this or any study of this over time that I know of anyway, and I appreciate it if some of you have seen things which I've not seen. We've not thought about it because in a way it's very obvious. Obviously we think, I guess a migrant would have certain expectations, and the country that sends and the country that receives and the people who find these migrants turning up on their soil, they must have expectations. What did they expect? but there's no clear record of it. And the more I thought about it, the harder it was to pin it down. Here and there we find mentions, suggestions, very suggestive comments, and lots of things that are taken for granted. Lots of documents they just take for granted. Some of these things. So I just wondered whether we could actually dig a bit deeper. That the past is much more difficult. For in a way, we have contemporary records now. So if we look at the mix today, we probably have a better idea. We can actually talk much more about what people expect. You can actually interview people in oral history. You can actually find out, at least at the individual level, and then you can either multiply it or look at it through the eyes of different units, different organizations, families, societies, associations, religious groups, all kinds of, at all levels you can actually trace this. So it's a bit tricky, and as I said, I can't really suggest any easy way of handling this. So I'll just look at the mix today, the mix expectations today. It really is very complicated. For me, for example, today, because the materials are much more available now, unlike in the past when you look at fragments of documentations and records here and there, and you can use your imagination to think of the possible reasons why people left and what governments thought and what other people thought. But today, of course, we do have much better records. We do have, you can actually ask people and people tell you. So there's so many levels of it. The personal level, what does each individual expect from migrating and leaving home, for example? Or what does the family think? And what sort of discussions go on within families about why they leave and why they don't leave? Now, we do have records of this today. So anyway, you can imagine what you can do. You can actually collect also what governments think about people going and coming, and what the government's receiving, how they record, the entry points of people, the checkpoints. I mean, all these have been, of course, evolving through time. I mean, I can sort of imagine the past when the checkpoints was very, very limited. People just came in and out, moved in and out without record being kept properly, without bothering people. But today, it gets worse every year. The security checks and your profile is meticulously, as it were, looked over before you enter or leave and so on. So we have a different set of records altogether, with the expectations of who comes in and who goes out, where you come from, what your background is. All this is now available. We have it today. And the mix is just mind-boggling when you think of all the things that crop up when you have all this range of things happening. And now organizations are involved. Again, in the past, we for example, way past, we just think of just individuals joining a merchant group or going out trading or looking for adventure, whatever it is on a personal level. Today, we have actually large organizations behind people leaving, migrating, and so on. Some legal and some not so legal, and lots of money change hands, and lots of things happen behind the scenes, which some are very horrendous in their consequences. And all these things are now known. We actually have a record of them. And the price people will pay, I mean, how do you measure expectations? How much are you prepared to pay to move to somewhere else? Or how much do you expect people to pay you to move to your country, sort of thing? All these things are now coming into play in a very quantifiable way too, in a way which we never had before. And I'm struck by, once you think about it, there's just so much now is available. So the mix today, if you look around today, the materials are just too much for anyone to handle. So I'm just curious to know if we take this idea further, how do we get together and make sense of all the documentation, and can we draw any generalizations out of it all? I don't know. This is premature. I'm just really suggesting what has prompted me to want to pursue this a little further, and I hope it will interest you. And that is that in all this mix, we now know, for example, the kind of quality of people are looking at. Something, again, nothing like this that I know of from the past. Today, the quality of the migrants, the migration patterns now involve, as it were, from the lowest down to the highest in terms of qualifications, skills, and and achievements of the individuals concerned. And now we have a marketplace, as it were, for this kind of talent. We have organizations that actually go searching for talent, crossing borders. And yet at the same time we have these strict borders. So all these are, on the surface, somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, tremendous, rigorous efforts to check who comes in and out. On the other, reach out, extended interest in looking for talent, acquiring good people that you want, skilled people, rare skills that you want, and so on, which crosses borders without any problems at all. So that whole range, that's another aspect of the mix. So the proliferation of expectations, proliferation, and the quality of the expectations all seem to be changing very rapidly. And I cannot help being concerned, interested in the kind of industry involved in human mobility today. It's an industry, but it has always been an industry. When I think back of the days of the coolie trade, there was always somebody who organized it, who made money out of it, who in fact had well-organized networks of people to arrange for moving people around. But today, it's still there. It's just different levels. Again, look at different quality. What are you looking for? Who are you expecting to move? And who's looking for labor? Who's looking for brains? Whatever it is, who's looking for financial skills? All these things come to play. So the question of an industry, the migration industry, so to speak, and how that matches with the expectations of people. These people are experts. I mean, these people in the industry know what expectations are in a way that you and I may not have normally thought about it. They know how to do it. They know how to price it. They know where the market is, how to work it out. And I think that's in itself something worth pursuing, that it should become like this now as a commodity. And I think someone raised this a long time ago. I've forgotten who it was who talked about labor as a commodity. I think it was a friend in New York, Columbia. Adam he talked about as a commodity. So in a way we are commodifying migrants. Of course now we have to go, whether we include refugees or not. I'm not going to open up another area just absolutely beyond my imagination. But that's something else again. These are people who know, who have in fact tremendous experience and understanding people's expectations and the market, how it responds and so on. So we now have an industry. So in the mix of expectation, we're involving more and more people, more varieties of people, from customs officers and immigration officers all the way to the guys who are making fabulous fortunes out of it all. And what does it mean? What does it do to the people who are thinking of migrating, or thinking of or rejecting the idea of migration? What plays a role in the decisions people make, the choices they make, and where governments come in, where governments set up organizations. Now we also have governments doing that. That's another thing that's of great interest. I mean, we all know that one of the first people who seriously took migrants into account in government policies are the Chinese. I mean, when you think of it, I don't know of any other organizations that it became a central organ of the national government when the Kuomintang set up their governments. But even before the Kuomintang came to power, under the warlords, after Sun Yat-sen's 1912 Republic of China, there were official organs looking out for the Huaqiao. By that time, the terminology had come in, the legislation had come in, the organs were set up, officials were appointed to look out for the welfare. So it started with welfare, investments, supposedly protection, encouraging talent, and encouraging capital to be brought back from the rich overseas Chinese into the Chinese new factory systems that were appearing. All these, and they got more and more elaborate until you got the Qiao Wuyanhui of the Kuomintang after 1928, become a very serious, big organization, almost directly under the interest of the president himself. And certainly the foreign ministry will be involved in that. And that evolved. And after 1949, it was replicated by the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC. And it became a political weapon of both sides. And you can see this happening right through 49 to the present day, that the Chaoban and the Chao Wenhui, in a way, are kind of competitors in the business about the hearts and minds of the Chinese overseas, partly as a factor in the legitimization of the regimes, but also partly the fact that there were all sorts of implications, and what these implications are, I mean, there must be a long list of them. We don't see what their lists are, but we can imagine some of them anyway, as to what to do with these Chinese overseas, to what extent they can be an asset, to what extent they are liability, to what extent they can be directly harnessed to certain agendas of the government's concern. I think both governments are equally sensitive about this. And I mean, I lived through that period, so that I can give you my account, if you ever wanted, of how you go through that when you're faced with governments interested in what you stand for, what they can do with you or against you, or somehow engage you in their interests. So that, of course, we know that governments have taken interest. But what's interesting is that the Chinese were the first to systematically do that. I think, as I said, I know of no other country that did it so systematically and so continued, almost non-stop. I think it's never given up. And in fact, I remember being fascinated by the idea that when the term Huaqiao was going out of use, certainly in Southeast Asia and even elsewhere, with the new nationalism and so on, and people becoming Huaran and becoming nationals of foreign countries, the Huaqiao, Wei and the Chaoban struggle with this term Chao, what to do, and they have also inventive ways of recreating themselves and reinventing themselves to continue their work. So even when the terminology changed, the conditions change, and all kinds of other factors new factors have entered into the whole thing, the two organizations continue to heighten their interest, to sharpen their understanding of it, and continue to make their roles, as it were, relevant, and to make themselves useful to whichever government they served. And that to that extent, you can see there was a systematic interest in what to do, and that's from the government's point of view. And from that point of view, the rise of China is very significant, because if that systematic interest continues on both sides, and in the case of the PRC, as China becomes stronger, obviously the reasons for the interest in the Chinese overseas become quite different. I mean, when you think of it, when we started, we can relate it. When we started, it was to help the revolutionaries outside on the one hand, and help the government on the other side get capital and investment into the new industries that were building up in China. And they were, in a way, expecting the Chinese to actually help China, but in a particular way. And the listing that's on record. You can see that in the Chaoban and the Chao Wing, where all their mission statements, as it were, would actually outline what they have in mind, what they expected of the Chinese overseas. But is that still true? Is that still what it was? I mean, later on it seemed to change, and it varies here and there. And as the two governments competed with each other, they also had different stresses, different emphases on what they wanted. And right now, when China is strong and it has different interests and so on, what do they expect now from the Chinese overseas? And that's another sort of range. I won't go into that here for the moment. I just want to say that one other interesting development is that, of course, of the Liu Xuesen as potential migrants. I mean, they're not migrants, Liu Xuesen, but the percentage of them who become migrants is quite high, higher than anyone expected. I, for one, was a little surprised when Deng Xiaoping was asked about this, that he had no conditions for thousands of students going to the United States, no conditions for their returning, not like Singapore with bonds and so on and so forth, nothing like that, no conditions. And people asked him, well, did you expect them to come back? He didn't seem to bother him. He was quite relaxed about it. He said, no, if they don't want to come back, that's their choice. But the idea is that he was very confident that many will come back. I mean, I don't know whether he ever said that quite in so many words, but it didn't trouble him. And in a way, you go back to Taiwan, the same thing in the 1950s and 60s, as the Taiwanese students went to the United States. At that point, almost none went back. It was for different reasons. Some because they were going to be persecuted by the Kuomintang, others because they don't want to be Taiwanese, they want to be Chinese and rather stay abroad. For all sorts of reasons, the number of Taiwanese students who went to America, for example, who returned, are very, very small indeed. But yet, after the 1980s, when things changed, many of them came back. After they made their big name, they become big scholars, big entrepreneurs, and done very well, then they started going back to Taiwan again. Regime change in Taiwan, all kinds of other factors changed. So maybe Deng Xiaoping had that in mind, that he was very confident that one day when China's position changes, something like that, they'll come back. Why worry about it now? So the confidence there at that point, when I heard about it, I was quite surprised how confident he was. It didn't seem to worry him. But look at the figures today. The last figure I saw was quite amazing. From the Omei Chongxue Hui came up with some record which said that since the opening of China, something like 3.5 million students, 留学生, have gone abroad, of which something like 1.8 million have returned. Slightly more than half, about half have returned. But even then, of course, there's still 1.7 million still abroad. That's a lot of them. But again, they're now expecting more and more to come, and apparently last year alone, something like 300,000 留学生 returned to China in 2014. And so that's very high compared to the early years. So things are changing. So a thing like that, apart from expectations, they're also, in this case, a government, and two governments actually, very concerned and very directly interested and systematically, in a way, keeping an eye on all these Chinese, either to make them come back or induce them to come back, or find some use for them abroad. And this is something that we see evidence of, but it's not been looked at very clearly. But this question of expectations on the government side and the people, migrants who are actually going out, what are their expectations? How do they match? And how do you mix it? And thirdly, of course, as I said, the receiving countries, what are their expectations? This I'm not too clear about. I've seen bits and pieces here and there. Of course, when you are recruiting labor, that's one kind of expectation. You expect them to work very hard, sweat and brow and so on, and get your railroad built or roads built or mines and plantations, work hard, producing well. Well, that's one set of expectations, and you expect them to come, work, and then return. That's one kind of expectations. But there are others where you didn't bother. I mean, and this is of course true of the colonies rather than the nations. Now. Then you see where this whole story began. All those numbers began, large numbers began, when most places were colonies of Western Western commercial and national empires. And it was in those empires that coming and going was in a way much more relaxed and based on very simple principles. Whether you're fit, can work, and willing to work hard for low pay. So these are very simple criteria. And once you meet the criteria, you can come and go, and there's no real problems about that. So if you're fit and young and you're willing to do it, you know that you can go, and there are no questions asked. But today, a tremendous industry has grown up on the other end. The receiving end too is an industry, apart from, as I say, immigration officials and the security people and so on, who are working very hard to make sure who you are. But again, there's a different kind of demand. The kind of demand, the hosts have also changed. Who do they take? Why they take them? How do they select them? And selection processes have become more sophisticated, something that again has changed with the times. Your global modernity has also introduced modern techniques of checking and selecting, which now come into play. And the underlying expectations of that, again, I don't have any way of finding this out in any systematic way. Again, fragments here and there. On the whole, governments don't intervene in that, but some governments are more directly interested than others. But one other thing I thought was very interesting, I should have mentioned earlier on, and that is that the Chinese systematic exploration or evolution of this interest in the diaspora has been picked up by others. India, for example, how interesting it has been the last 10 or 15 years or so. The Indian government has taken a great interest in the NRIs, who in the past they didn't bother with. In fact, in Nehru's time and the others, they were rather dismissive of these people who go away and don't come back. But today they are actually actively trying to woo them. And I saw a report, was it yesterday, where Mr. Modi's meeting in Wembley in London. He was like a rock star, and all these NRIs.
He's the Prime Minister of NRIs.
Like Prime Minister of the NRIs, yeah. And he had a massive crowd there, and he was cheering them, saying, "Come and help India." And they were all wanting to help India, wanting Modi to enable them to be of service to India. And in fact, behind it all, they are very conscious of the Chinese example. I've heard so many of them say, the Chinese did that so successfully over those last few decades and last century. And we haven't been doing that. What do we need to do? How do we do it? And so on. So the Chinese experience, in a way, has become a model now, at least for India. I remember also in the early days when I heard Russians talk about it too. When they said, what about the Russians all over the place? And they're not coming back. They're not even interested. If some of them become very hostile towards the Soviet Union. So the Russian diaspora was regarded almost as the enemy at one point. And yet, and others who talk about, well, China's success, because of the overseas Chinese. And we Russians are not making full use of our overseas Russians, as it were, to help the economy of Russia. Now, I'm only just quoting some of these anecdotal things, but have not seen any systematic look at what do governments now expect of their people, ethnic groups overseas. May not be their citizens anymore, or they're even identifying with them, or even caring for them much openly. But nevertheless, what do they expect of them? Do they have any? And are they more sensitive about this, or more concerned about this? Is the Chinese model or example of the last century and a half something that is being taken into account in other people thinking of their diasporas and so on? I'm not sure, because there are very interesting examples where the diaspora doesn't matter because they're there already and they are playing a fantastic part. Like the Anglo-Celtic or Anglo-Saxon diaspora. You don't even use the word diaspora. You don't need to, because they're actually linked together by a common language, common culture, common history in so many ways, common institutions which tie them together, and they're active without any governments having to do anything about it. So there's another model which is liberal, open, and yet it has been very, very resilient, and they do link together. And the kind of loyalties that people feel in Canada towards Britain, or Australia towards Britain, or even to Americans, some Americans feel about Europe, and all that is natural. You don't need any official display of welcoming or anything like that. Every now and then you have some bits of it couched in cultural and nostalgic terms, but not a systematic government effort to link up with the diaspora the way the Chinese did. Now, the Chinese did that, of course, as I understand it. The Chinese did it at a time when China was very weak. And the Chinese out there felt very unprotected and discriminated against, and felt that their mother country didn't care for them, and they resented it, and they sought protection. So there was a particular situation that created this Chinese model. They made it attractive for leaders, both the revolutionary as well as the Qing government, to take an interest in their Chinese overseas. And of course, in the time when it was also a colonial situation in which all these Chinese overseas, particularly in Southeast Asia, they had no citizenship anyway. The idea of citizenship would never crop up. They could never become British or French or Dutch or Americans while being in their colonies. So since they were without citizenship, without any kind of national identity, of course they were Chinese. So the concept of Huaqiao was perfectly legitimate and accurate. They were Chinese, that the Chinese government had neglected for centuries, and now the Chinese government is offering to giving them some protection and also want them to help China. So that was the motivation. You can see that. But if that is the reason why the Chinese model was created, why would it be of interest today? I mean, so we know that, and the India example is because the Indian feels that there's a tremendous potential in India. Somehow the Indian government is missing out, and there's one missing element is that there's so much talent out there, capital as well as talent and experience and skills, which are not used by India. Some are lost to India, and something ought to be done. And look at the Chinese; they've done very well out of it. Now, whether true or not, that's the effect of the Chinese diaspora story among other people. So that itself has a impact, if you will, on affairs outside. Again, expectation. How do you measure it? What exactly we need to do to find out or to understand how these expectations were started, how it began, how it evolved, what changes it, and what makes it more significant, and what makes it more economically and politically significant today. I have the greatest difficulty with the fourth example, the residents, the local residents, the local peoples, because on the whole they kept no records. At least in Southeast Asia they didn't. In North America they did, so we have plenty of North American documents about the local residents, and when they didn't like Chinese laborers or something like that, they made it very clear. And at least we have plenty of records to show that they didn't like them. And so we have that. So that is very clear. But in the Southeast Asian case, very few records. We have mostly post facto records. Once they become nation states, then you find memories coming back to say, oh, how the Chinese were either exploiting us or cheating us, and they made lots of money and they made no contribution. They made the money and they spent it, brought it back to China and left nothing behind for us. So something ought to be done. So these are post facto ones. But the contemporary records, very few, because they were under colonial rule, and the colonials kept a different set of records, as it were. The colonial view of it was the dominant view, and the indigenous peoples, the local peoples, were silent, on the whole silent about what they felt. Of course, by the 20th century, with new nationalism coming in, more and more of the opinions came in, and certainly the merchant classes and trading classes who found the Chinese over too competitive and too hard to compete with made their feelings known, and this was built up. Some countries are more than others. Certainly in Indonesia, as Leo has done a lot of work to show that we know what the Indonesian nationalists began to feel, that the trading groups felt about the competition from the Chinese. We know some of that, but on the whole, we don't have a great deal of information about this. And I do feel that here is where I think literature comes in a lot. Some of the literature is post facto, but there is writing from the period which do mention, more than the historical documents, official documents, as I said, tended to be the colonial ones, but the non-official, the literary records, some of the, of course, newspapers came rather late on the whole, only in the 20th century, but some of the literature, the early literature, you do find some references, and more, as more and more literature gets written. In fact, of course, for literature, where literature is concerned, for both the migrants and the residents, you have quite a lot, and more and more being written today, more and more of good quality work has been written. Some of the best work actually has been written in North America, where some very fine literary people have entered into the field and captured the spirit much better on the whole than in Southeast Asia. But in Southeast Asia, they've been done mostly, of course, in local languages or in Chinese, and not so accessible to others. So they are only read by the people of that community. Again, I've not actually seen a systematic exploration of this literary material to try and capture the way expectations changed over time. One can again get fragments of it. I mean, I for one found it very interesting to find, for example, in the 1870s, which is to me one of the turning points. The turning point that captures my imagination is the turning point of communications, a revolution in communications, transport being so much easier, newspapers, telegraphs, and so on, so that the information available to migrants, both migrants who are outside and people at home, that information to make decisions about where to go, when to go, and so on, became qualitatively different. It was from the 1870s onwards. In fact, you can actually track that decade after decade as it becomes better and better. By the time we come to the 21st century, whether you're a migrant or not probably isn't that important anymore. You are actually in touch with your family people at any moment of the day, telephones, Skype, or whatever it is. In a way, the question of being a migrant and being at home, who stays at home, who goes out, it's a different kind of decision. You are actually in touch. Your connections are never really broken. But in the early days, of course, they were totally broken. I mean, my wife and I remember very much when we were students in England. It took weeks to write a letter, get a letter home write home and get letter home, and it cost money. I mean, it was expensive. The telephones are just impossible. Nobody could afford a telephone call. We wrote on air letters to make it less expensive. And so that sort of thing. And yet in our own lifetime, this will be totally transformed. I mean, we can be daily in touch with our children or grandchildren if we wanted to. And I'm sure this is true for everybody. What really caught my attention some while back now, when I met some people, Hmongs in Australia, who told me about how they kept in touch with their relatives, and I was really quite staggered by that. They had discovered that what you did was you bought a recording machine and you send one home to your people, and you had tapes, and you record it and you send it, post it, and they have your voice and you get your latest account, and you don't even have to write a letter. I mean, it's all done. And they were doing it regularly, systematically, and they organized themselves as a community so that everybody could get access to the machines and get access to the technology, techniques, and the whole community was in touch. The whole community back in the middle of Laos with no problem, no difficulty at all. They didn't seem to worry too much, knew exactly what was happening on both sides. So that was the first time I noticed it in the 1970s when the refugees were arriving in Australia. And very quickly they caught on to this. So the speed at which people are responding to new technologies, their expectations of being distant and isolated and so on, no longer true. They expect to be, in fact, constantly in contact. And so what does it mean to be a migrant in that case? What do you lose, what do you gain, psychologically, socially, culturally? I don't know. It seems to take on a different dimension altogether. So that's another area where the residents, how do the residents cope with people who are not actually with you? They come and live amongst you, but they can live in a completely different world and have nothing to do with you at all. I mean, it's almost like living in a condo, You're all in one building, but you never see each other except in the lift or something. And then that's in a way how it is today. Your residents and your migrants can be quite comfortable living without actually having any kind of contact with one another. I mean, so there's different work. But if you go back to the past, that was not so. When you're a Chinese trader opening a shop, a little gadai in the kampung and so on, you are very much involved in everybody. You are part of the community. You have to live with them, learn to be like them, and they have to get to know you, and you have to trust each other. They build all kinds of bonds which were essential for any kind of relationship at all. But today, not true. And in the bigger the city, of course, cities were like that anyway for everybody, but in the big cities, being a migrant is a kind of different experience altogether. I mean, it doesn't have to involve any kind of isolation or distancing or separation, and all those, even the concept of transnationalism becomes immaterial. It's nothing to do with national anything at all. This is well beyond that. And so that's another dimension. So what the residents of a country now expect of their migrants is something that intrigues me. What do they think? As I said, I have fragments of information about what they thought in the 19th century, a little more about what they thought in the 20th century. But what does it mean today to find all these migrants amongst you? So the only kind of reaction is either a kind of xenophobic reaction, which is just rejection, because you're not going to get intimate relations very easily today. You don't need to. The problem is that the world has created so many ways and means for you to actually avoid seeing each other and not having to have contact in a way which was unknown in the past. So all these new technologies and new communication systems actually take you into another atmospheric environment. And so all these seem to me, again, requires some fresh thinking on our part how to deal with it. So I don't know what present residents think about migrants. The recent experience in Singapore in the last elections in 2011 suggested that Singaporeans suddenly became aware of lots and lots of residents, foreign residents amongst them, and that the increase in numbers had been rather dramatic, and the reaction was pretty strong. And it affected the government, and it forced the government to change policy. So that's a kind of a sudden awakeness of why so many foreigners around you? Where did they come from? What are they doing here? And the governments failed to explain it. So there are all sorts of interesting developments pertaining to the migrants themselves, the governments from sending and the receiving part, and the residents, now much more articulate, much more sensitive, much more aware of what their own rights and are and should be, and more defensive. So it's creating again a new set of, new mix of expectations. I actually had written out a paper which goes on to actually compare periods like 1870s and then the 1950s, which is the other one which is, I think, very significant. 1870s because I said there was a total change in communication systems and transportation, but also one other thing. It was the beginning of something completely new for the Chinese migration history of the past, was that it became possible for women to join their men. Mm-hmm. About 1870s it began, and it became very common by the 1890s. By the turn of the century, it was more or less taken as for granted that it was possible for families, husband and wife, to bring their wife and children to come out to at least to Southeast Asia. In the migrant states of United States and others, that's the opposite happened for a long time. But 1950s is an interesting turning point again for all sorts of reasons. I mentioned the obvious ones for decolonization in the colonies. Of course, that created a completely new set of nation states with different expectations of their Chinese, who are, in the eyes of the indigenous leaders, who were brought there without their consent, as it were, by the colonial governments, and asked the question, why should we be the victims of colonial decisions to bring all these people without our permission or agreement? And so there are all sort of political echoes there which are still with us. It's not at all it's all something that will disappear rapidly. I think those in Malaysia will talk about this. Pendatang business has become a major political issue today, and I think it will remain for a long time. Who is pendatang and who has settled and so on? Pendatang is a newcomer, a migrant who come from somewhere else. But these are, in the 1950s, that's a turning point. But there's a turning point on all sorts of grounds, as you can imagine. The new nation states, of course, the consciousness of a different kind of China, China that's once again united, which it had not been for more than half a century, and then over the last 50 years, its ability to get their act together in China after all their tribulations within the country, and now they're rising economically and of course politically, and that has consequences. So we're in a new world. So 1950s was a major turning point. It changed completely from the earlier times. In North America and Oceania, it was a big change because they started to relax the immigration laws, of course, a bit late till 1964, but the process had begun in 1942, was it, when they first relaxed the Chinese side for during the war? 43. And then in 64, 65, they changed the Immigration Act. So again, between 40s and 60s, the 50s was a major turning point for everybody. So in my paper, I concentrate on these two just to illustrate how expectations change, where there may be sort of sudden set of new changes which bring about new kinds of expectations, which then influence all the four groups of people that I look at. And I think these two periods are quite useful because they help us to then look at the last decade. The last decade and today, we are looking at, again, very, very complicated things. I can't go into that in any detail, but I just want to make some simple comparisons between what I call the old mix of expectation and the new mix, between the old mix and the new mix. I would simply, first of all, I think we do need new methods to look at this. I don't have them. New methodologies, I think, are necessary to try and pick out examples of change in people's thinking about expectations on all sides. And then to make comparisons. I think these are the three areas I would look at: the methodologies, the new way of documenting what we're talking about, and how useful are they for comparative purposes. One thing that struck me was how expectations rise and fall. When, of course, we can now say that in some cases we now have records of people's expectations being too high. In the old days, we can probably be too low. People expect nothing, just to be alive, to have a living, to give any bit of work, be satisfied. Today, we have very high higher expectations, and we have now records of people with too high expectations, terribly disappointed, great deal of disappointment, and so on. But there are others, however, who adjust. They start with the wrong set of expectations, and they tone it down, they lessen it, and they adjust, and they learn how to be satisfied with less, as it were. And so you adjust how you adjust to expectations. If you start low, what happens? Things get better. If you start high, how do you adjust to things getting worse, as it were? How people respond to that. These are the individual level, but also at levels of families and small communities where who have no political power, no economic power that is significant. Then they have to operate in maybe hostile or not particularly friendly conditions, and then they have to adjust their expectations accordingly. So that's one, from too low and too high, and what is realistic. And there's the industry also there, because I think there are now people who are educated to talk about this. I came across people who set up companies that advise people on migration, not only on the legal and technical side, but also on expectations, educating people what to do when they move in. So there's an industry around this that actually enlightens people, as it were, about what it means to migrate and so on. So there's quite an interesting area there too, to make people more realistic about what to expect and what not to expect. And I think most people do need a lot of education when they go to another place, a strange place. How would they know anyway? So they do need help, and that industry has grown up, and that also means that on the whole, migrants today are much, much more queued up as to what to expect. And so that's another thing. If you are queued up, then you're realistic about what to expect and so on. That also has effect on the decisions you make and choices you make. The other area that I again don't have any suggestions as what to do, but I'm just noting the speed of change. The expectations rise and fall at all levels. All these four groups of people involved, their expectations change very, very fast. And sometimes they change faster than people expect, and lots of people suffer from that. Decisions get changed, policies change very rapidly for maybe political or economic or other reasons, but they change very rapidly, and migrants have to learn how to respond to that and adjust and adapt to those new changes very quickly. And then that, I think, leads to different kinds of organizations being involved. Because, for example, I was thinking that in the early days, what would the chap who goes from Xiamen to Jakarta or Batavia expect? He expects to have relatives out there, or he expects to have a gongsi out there, a temple or a group of people who look after him when he arrives, or a group of them arrive together. Somebody will help him. There's an organization, but it was in a way very simple. Nobody interfered with them. They could just do that, and word of mouth, probably just back and forth, telling each other what to bring with you, what to expect, what you should have to do beforehand, and so on. But today, this is much more systematic. You can find out on the web, and also the way. So that's another area. Let me go quickly now to last 2 points I want to make. And expectations change and changeable and are in any way transitional. But the one key thing that I think still remains quite the interesting one, and I don't know how people's expectations are going to change in time, and that is the question of assimilation. This question is a very difficult one. In the natural course of things, people who migrate eventually assimilate. This is a kind of natural course, and everybody should expect that. If you stay out there for a long time, you have family, children there, after 3 or 4 generations, you must expect to assimilate. Now that expectation, I think, has become very complex now in the modern world. Why assimilate? And what is this multiculturalism that people talk about? In some countries believe in it, some people don't, some countries don't. So the countries that do probably attract more migrants than the countries who don't. But when you're there, when you're faced with these issues, what do you decide? Do you fight against that natural cause of assimilation, or do you in fact accept that as natural and realistic, and in fact the right thing to do for your future generations? Assimilate and belong and become part and parcel of the country that you moved into, and not think about it. That's a natural way of changing and adapting to your environment, and should not be questioned. And yet I can see that with the kind of consciousness about diaspora movements and rights and migrations and minority rights and multiculturalism, all the other ideas that have come forth, you may well say, I don't want my children or grandchildren to assimilate. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they don't. Mind you, it was there before, but now you can actually do it. It's much easier to do it today to ensure. But to do that also you need to organize, you get resistance, you get conflict, you get ethnic differences coming to the fore. So it's one of the unintended consequences of better education about what your rights are as a minority and so on, and the whole question of future natural process of assimilation that one used to take for granted. You can't take that for granted anymore. And finally, I end with what I started out with, the rise of China, and where China is concerned. The China factor and I would say the China factor, of course, has lots of things which are predictable because it's big and it's rich and strong, but there are lots of unpredictable elements to it. Of course, we understand that. And the unintended consequences of some of the policies made in Beijing and Taiwan and Taipei, I think we cannot rule them out. They will continue to happen. They've happened in the past again and again throughout the 20th century. The unintended consequences of some of the policies made for one reason, with results which are just the opposite and so on. And I think this will continue to happen and something to look out for. But what do we do to understand it? I don't know. But the fact is that there are factors that help the Chinese to have a rich and powerful China, but it has opposite effect in some places where people are more and more afraid of China, and therefore has consequences on the Chinese people who settle there. And what pressures that would put upon the Chinese to assimilate and accept the local conditions, all that will have to be taken into account. And I simply end on saying that, of course, this generally the new stage in which China has emerged in international politics, particularly in Asia, with Asia in general benefiting from the modernization process that you have talked so much about, your global modernity, is the more obvious part is these technological and financial skills that have been mastered by Indians and Chinese and so on. And that's been really so dramatically changing the face of Asia, and will continue to change in the next few decades. Now, what that would do to people's expectations at all levels, at all the 4 levels that I mentioned, I think is very worth keeping an eye on.
Thank you very much.